Society at Adelaide Uni, and Tony Rowbotham, who is a Christian evangelist and works with Christian student group at Rowbotham University. Please join me in welcoming them both today. The format for the next hour will be as follows. Both speakers will present a 7-minute address on the topic, "Is Christianity supported by real evidence?" I will ring a bell once at 6 minutes and then continuously at 7 minutes. Once both speakers have presented, I will conduct a moderated question and answer time. Questions will be from the floor and those texted into the number, which is written on your link that you were given on the way. Please keep your questions brief. We understand that everyone is busy, so we will close and take a break at 2 p.m, allowing everyone to get to their next commitments. However, if you are free and interested, we will have more question and answer time until 2:30 if you would like to stay. Please turn your mobile phones onto silent if you have not already. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Scott forward to speak for us.
Thank you, everyone. First, I'd just like to start off by acknowledging that we're here today on Gunner land and the importance that country has to the Gunner people and all First Nations people here in Australia. Now, the topic today is Christianity supported by real evidence. Christianity exists. You're all evidence of that. The people that have organised today are evidence of that. However, is it supported by real evidence? We have to ask first off 2 questions. What's evidence and what's real evidence? There's many different types of evidence that exist. There's the evidence that you all got up this morning. You're here today. That's evidence that you got up this morning. I can see that, you can all see that. There's evidence that we live in a society governed by laws. How do we know that? More or less, no one goes around murdering anyone. Generally because we're 1, unlikely to, and 2, the punishments that our laws impose upon us. And then there's a third type of evidence, which if anyone here is doing any sort of degree associated with the sciences, will know inside out. And that's whether or not something is reproducible and is able to be investigated by other people. So I've covered a few types of evidence. It's eyewitness, experience, and then scientific. I contend that whilst Christianity might be supported by eyewitness and by experience, that doesn't constitute enough evidence for a layperson, as someone who has no experience with Christianity before today, to come to the conclusion that Christianity is supported by real evidence and therefore true. Now, I'm not saying this to discount your beliefs, your strongly held convictions that Christianity is true according to what you believe. We have to, when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about proving something to someone else, someone who has no experience with what we're claiming. When we claim, for example, that gravity exists, we can state it, gravity exists. Are you just going to take my word for it? If you're a rational, thinking mind, you shouldn't. You shouldn't just take my word for it. You need to stop and think, okay, if gravity exists, what should I see? If gravity exists, how can I test it? Now, see, we all have experience with gravity. We all have a varying degree understanding of how gravity works. But then, that theory of gravity has changed throughout history. And as we've investigated further and further, and we've found more and more evidence supporting the theory of gravity as it exists today. And it's available for everyone here in this room to investigate themselves. They can go away and do experiments. you can do an experiment when you go home to verify if gravity exists. You can go and do an experiment and to verify whether antibiotics work. Or go away and do an experiment, verify whether antibiotics are starting to not work in some cases. So, this idea of real evidence is around that layperson, someone who has had no experience with the topic before. Can you present enough evidence to them to support your position, to support that Christianity is true with a capital T? It might be true for you. It might help you live a better life. But is it true objectively? I contend that it isn't. I'm going to stop there because I like much more time for Q&A, questions from you, you can pick my brain, and I'd really like to hear what Tony has to say. Thank you. That's my statement, my presentation right now, is that Christianity isn't supported by real evidence. It's supported by eyewitness testimony. It's supported by your experiences. But that isn't enough for someone who has had no experience with Christianity to come to the conclusion that it is supported by real evidence. Thank you very much.
Scott, I'll just clarify before we go on. If you are texting questions in, please specify which speaker you would like the question to go to. I'll now invite Tony up to speak for us.
Thank you, Scott. It's great. It is excellent to be here to be thinking about a topic that's so important. Not just the topic of Christianity, but also the topic of how it is we engage with the world, how it is we think, work out what is true, what is real. And I'm really pleased with the way Scott's kicked us off in thinking a lot about what is evidence and what constitutes real evidence. And I actually want to begin as well at that point, because if we don't address that issue, we often can't go much further than that. What I want to suggest in the time I've got to kick off is I want to do two things. I want to ask the question, what constitutes real evidence? And then I want to just give a few little examples of how some of that evidence can be evidence for considering Christianity, in particular considering Jesus. So the first one, what's real evidence? Well, Scott's absolutely right. There are all sorts of different types of evidences. And I was really pleased to hear him say that. I want to talk specifically about historical evidence. For without firm historical evidence for the Bible being reliable, Christianity, we may as well not go any further. And so this is a really important point for Christians. What makes and constitutes real evidence historically? The basis of historical evidence is witnesses. Okay, that shouldn't surprise any of us. But the earlier the witness, that is, the closer to the event, the better. The more reliable the witness, what that witness tells us, and the trustworthiness of that witness, all those two things add up in terms of historical method to having a confidence or a degree of confidence about what really happened and the claims that can be made. The best witnesses are eyewitnesses. The best witnesses are eyewitnesses. Because and for two reasons. Eyewitnesses give you access to the first person account of the event. Much better than a second person account. They give you first person access to an event. In historical method, this is really important. It's one of the things they look at. You might remember when I was growing up, I don't know if they still do it, but Channel 10 had the slogan Eyewitness News. Okay? Their news was news from eyewitnesses. It wasn't kind of news from reporters, it came from eyewitnesses. More seriously though, the US Department of Justice realised how important eyewitness accounts are. And so what they did is they put together a report that they wanted all their police forces across America to take notice of and to think about and actually change how it is they gathered evidence from eyewitnesses. And this is one of the things they said. Eyewitnesses play a critical role in our criminal justice system. They are often essential to identifying, charging and ultimately convicting perpetrators of crime. and in some cases may provide the sole piece of evidence against those individuals. For these reasons, the value of accurate and reliable eyewitness evidence cannot be overstated. And they went on to say that the vast majority of eyewitness identifications are accurate, okay, contrary to the things that you hear in the news, and provide trustworthy evidence for the trier of fact. And recognising the weight that juries and judges give to eyewitnesses' evidence, and then they put out a whole training manual on this. The best witnesses are eyewitnesses because they give you first-person access, but the best witnesses are eyewitnesses for another reason. First-person access gives you access to intent, purpose, circumstances, emotion, all sorts of other things that are going on. There's work to be done around reliability, but what we have in the Bible, what we have in the New Testament, are eyewitness accounts of Jesus. So what we've got to do is work out how reliable are these sources. Now, why am I doing this? Why am I spending a bit of time on this? The main reason is because many people are confused as to what constitutes real evidence historically. Many people subscribe not to science, but to scientism. And scientism says the only way to access truth is via science. You've only got to do a first-year philosophy of science course to realise that's wrong. And it won't just be me saying, it'll be your lecturer. And it denies the truth value of anything other than what we find and see through scientific method. What constitutes real evidence in history are early and reliable witnesses. And what I guess I want to invite us to do today is to be open to good historical method and invite you to think more about Jesus. Okay, a couple of things I just want to comment in terms of historical method and a couple of bits of evidence. One of the, I'll just pick on Luke's Gospel to start with. It's a biography of Jesus, in one of the first 4 books, or extensive accounts about Jesus. And Luke says at the beginning, he's a doctor, he says at the beginning, I've gone to all the eyewitnesses. Very deliberate. I've gone to all the eyewitnesses. I've carefully investigated everything. I've heard what they've said, I've investigated it, I've put it in an orderly account, is what he says, so that you might know with certainty what's gone on. That sounds like he's writing a PhD or a history paper or something, but that's what he's deliberately, intentionally doing. The rest of the New Testament requires people who speak about Jesus to have eyewitness accounts. And so there's a big tick historically. A couple of others. One of the other tools, just quickly, that historians use is a tool called the criterion of embarrassment. That is the stuff that's getting written down going to embarrass the leaders of the movement or the people in charge, or is it going to be an embarrassment to the movement as a whole? One of the things, by using that criterion of embarrassment, one of the things we discover is that, for instance, one of the very first people who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus were women. Culturally, that is a massive mistake. The testimony of women in a court of law in those was inadmissible. And yet the New Testament very happily recorded women as the first people who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. If you're trying to embarrass yourself, that is one of the things to do. We'll keep talking later. Excellent.
We'll now proceed into the question and answer time. This is a chance for you to ask questions of Scott and Tony regarding the topic on which they have just spoken. Please keep all questions on topic and within 30 seconds. As moderator, I hold the right to refuse questions that I deem inappropriate and off topic. We also ask that all questions are actually questions and that you understand this is not a chance for everyone to state their own opinion. Please be respectful to both speakers and audience members. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to answer, and I will ring the bell at 3 minutes to let you know. When asking your question, please outline whom you are asking the question of, Scott or Tony or both. When I open the floor for questions, please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. I will then make reference to someone and invite him or her to stand and ask their question. Once you have asked your question, you may be seated. Once the speaker has completed their answer, I'll open the floor again for questions. Once we have answered some questions from the floor, I will direct some of the texted questions to the speakers. I now invite anyone to raise their hand and begin our question and answer time.
I already texted my question, if that's okay. Okay, this is a question for Tony. So your assertion is mostly about historical viewing the four Gospels as the sort of historical support. However, the Bible makes claims which are not necessarily historical in nature. Some of them might be metaphysical, philosophical, supernatural, or beyond the realms of historical knowledge. How does your analysis of the Bible as historical evidence help support these claims?
Thank you. That's actually a great question, and it strikes at what Scott was raising earlier, and what I was wanting to get to as well. That is, the Bible does make claims about the metaphysical, about God. It makes claims about life and death, what's going to happen beyond death. It makes all sorts of claims in areas that we don't have ideas about and we can't test ourselves. So the reason to start with the historical component is to go, if the Bible's not reliable historically, then we can't trust it in other areas. And so what we need to do is we need to go, can the Bible be trusted in these areas that we can see and understand? And let's test it in those areas, for if it's reliable there, then it has a chance. Okay, and I think this is what Scott's hitting at, and he's right. If the Bible's reliable there, then it has a chance of being reliable in other areas. And that's why we must start there. Does that answer your question?
But it doesn't necessarily follow that it will be reliable in these areas. So
yeah, that's correct. So so what I've just said isn't a demonstration that everything the Bible says is true, but what it is a demonstration that it's possible that the Bible is true in these other areas. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, this question is for Scott. So in both sides, we have Christianity and science, and there's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of books on we were talking about enough evidence. I was just wondering, when is enough enough? Does it boil down to personal conviction or actual books that you can quantify? Is it quantifiable that enough evidence is enough, or does it really boil down to
Okay.
experience?
For me personally, it's a balanced probability question. And so, me personally, the investigations that I've done on balance of probabilities, Christianity doesn't hold the sway. I'd actually flip the question around to a lot of you in the audience. At what point, how much evidence would it take you to change your religion? How much evidence would it take you to become a Hindu? How much evidence would it take you to become a Mormon or a Scientologist or a Muslim? How much evidence would it take you to change your religion? And you'll probably have a close approximation to what it might take me. If your answer is divine inspiration, divine intervention, a personal experience, that's not going to be my answer. But if your answer is within the realm of what's testable, what's repeatable, what other people can go and investigate too, then that's going to be my answer. So if someone else can go and investigate the evidence that you're claiming and claim for the metaphysical stuff too, then on the balance of probabilities, I will probably accept that Christianity is true. That doesn't mean I'm going to suddenly be worshipping God and Jesus. That's an entirely different question. But on the question of acceptance, it's going to be that, is it possible for me to go and investigate? Is it possible for someone that I know to go and investigate? Is it possible for someone I don't know to go and investigate and come to the same conclusion? And that's what the scientific method is all about. It's not scientism, as Tony was saying. The scientific method is about that reproducibility. Can someone else go and investigate it and get that same result, come to that same conclusion? If that's not possible, if a different conclusion is being reached every single time, then it isn't evidence worth weighing up. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
With regards to evidence and historical bearing, this is for either of you, how would you go about explaining the fact that there is archaeological evidence showing that early Judaism had a root in polytheistic Babylonian society, and the fact that Yahweh actually comes from the Babylonian god of war, that Asherah, which is still a word in the Yiddish language, is for singing, and Baal actually is presented within Exodus as the golden cup?
For start, let me just, you've asked a very technical question. You're obviously researched up on it, I'm not. So let me just say anything I would say, I'm going to take with a grain of salt, because I don't know all the things you're referring to. Except to say that I think the confidence with which you speak of drawing all the dots and connections, I suspect scholars would be much slower to draw. And so I just don't think the confidence with the assertions follow that starts with Babylonian and goes all the way along. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. What I can say is in Exodus, referring to Exodus, is the golden calf incident is not recorded in Exodus as a Baal incident and a worship of Baal. It's recorded in the Old Testament as a worship of the God who brought us out of Egypt. So they thought they were worshipping the Lord. They thought they were worshipping the Lord, but the Lord had said, "Don't worship me with idols," and they created an idol, a golden calf. So in Exodus, it's actually not recorded as a Baal incident. It's recorded as an illegitimate worship of the Lord. So that's the only one I can confidently answer. But I would just, I'm always nervous of really tight lines that are drawn, and I feel like I need to do a lot more research and thinking to even be able to engage with the question. So, yeah, that's as much as I can say.
Excuse me, you didn't fully go into the question. I'm saying that, well, Baal was depicted as a golden calf, whereas Yahweh was depicted differently. And the fact that this is from peer-reviewed articles shows that there is archaeological evidence. Even in early Israelite society, there are symbols of these multiple gods intertwined, not just spurious claims.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, because Israel always got involved in the worship of the gods around them. That's what the Old Testament says. So just because they exist doesn't, you've then got to work out what conclusions you want to draw. Okay, so that's as much as I can say. So I just don't want to jump to they exist, therefore they did. There's a whole bunch more questions that I need to think about and address. Okay?
Well, the problem is the polytheistic origin of that religion. If it's a monotheistic religion, then it must have always been monotheistic.
Yes, but the practice of it has always differed, hasn't it? So that's part of the problem. I don't think I can engage with you at any more level, because I'm at a level of ignorance with where you want to take the question, but I can only specify other ways of seeing the evidence. Yeah, that's all I can do.
On that, I draw your attention, we can trace the evolution of different religions through the different texts that they've left through the archaeological evidence, and we can trace the evolution of Greek mythology into Roman mythology, and then the sudden change into Christian mythology. And the same for mythologies in the Near East, in Far East, to use those terms, and how they've changed. So we can see these changes going through. And we also have modern day examples of new religions forming. I referred to a couple of them, Mormonism, Scientology. So we've seen how religions start. And again, I'm not completely across the changes between polytheism into monotheism, but I do know there was an earlier monotheistic cult in the same region before Christianity sprung up. So it's not like Christianity was something brand new. This is a brand new idea that we're worshipping a single God. It had been done before in that same region. But that's as far as my knowledge extends into that particular area. And we can study the changes in religions elsewhere in the world. So when we've got examples elsewhere, there's no reason to assume that Christianity in particular is something special and it's done a different way.
Now I read a texted question. This is to Scott. You said laws are a form of visible evidence. If those laws are a form of visible evidence, where do they come from?
I didn't say laws were the evidence. I said the evidence that we live in a society governed by laws is around us. So the fact there's evidence that the laws exist. Someone could just claim that there's a number of different laws. For example, they could claim that there's a law against wearing polka dots. Is there evidence for a law against wearing polka dots in society today? Are people being arrested? Are they being fined for wearing polka dots? No, they're not. There's no evidence supporting that that law exists. But there is evidence for supporting the existence of the other laws. So that's what I was saying. I wasn't saying that laws are evidence. I was saying there's evidence for laws, and that's our experiences. So the question was, for those that couldn't hear, around different types of scientific evidence, and what was put forward was that evolution doesn't hold up to the same standard of evidence that, say, the physics of gravity does. I'd say that you have a misunderstanding of the science of evolution. The evidence is there, and whilst it's until recently, there hasn't been experimental evidence, but there is now experimental evidence. They've done experiments with fruit flies and the mutation of genes across time, 3 generations, and they've basically created a separate species of fruit fly. And they've done similar things with microbes. They've mutated, and all of a sudden, they can now metabolize a completely different source of energy. So there is experimental evidence for evolution, but even without that, the evidence for evolution is incredibly strong. It's DNA evidence along with the fossil record evidence. And when I was describing the scientific method, it's, can someone else go and investigate it? So someone else can go and investigate the fossil record. They can investigate where fossils are occurring and see, does that match up with what evolutionary biology is predicting, has predicted? Is there a disagreement? Is there you may have heard this before. Is there a fossil of a bunny rabbit in Precambrian rock sediment? If there is, that would completely and utterly invalidate evolutionary theory. And to date, nothing has been found that invalidates evolutionary theory. That doesn't say that something will be found in the future. Always bears remembering that science is open to change. Science is open to new evidence and new reproducible evidence. So if that comes along, they will rethink evolutionary theory. What won't cause a rethink in evolutionary theory is asserting that the evidence that currently exists that supports it doesn't actually support it.
I have another texted question now. This one's for Tony. How can eyewitnesses be the most reliable form of evidence when humans are the least reliable form of scientific method due to biases and the power of the brain to deceive?
I think it's simply because what you've got to do is assess the reliability of the eyewitness. So eyewitness is always better than a secondary witness. An eyewitness is always better than a tertiary witness. So you just end up with less and less access to the truth the further away you move. And so this is not me talking, this is historical method. You are always better off with you will have done it at uni. A primary source is better than a secondary source. Is that not true? So you always go to the primary source. Then what you have to do is work out what you can do with that primary source. Okay? And so that's always the question. If you have a primary source and you have a secondary source, you should always go to the primary source, and that should not surprise us as university students. How do we explain bias and that sort of thing? One level, I was put it broadly, we all have biases. We understand post-modernity. We understand that we all bring bias to whatever we look at, whoever we are. So there's no isolation from that. Interestingly, as I did the quote from the US Department of Justice, an eyewitness who's been the subject of a criminal action has bias, don't they? They want this person locked up in jail. They want justice. And yet, eyewitness testimony is of foundational importance to any justice system. Now, does bias mean that that person is deemed untrustworthy? The answer is no. You've got to work out what you can trust from this person and from this witness. Okay, so just because there is bias doesn't automatically discount eyewitness testimony. So we've just got to come to terms with that, recognise that, and recognise whoever we are, we bring our coloured glasses as either an eyewitness or as someone assessing the eyewitness. We've got to do our best to get rid of the colour as much as we possibly can. Okay? And historical method helps us with that. That's why we have it. Excellent.
We'll take another question from the floor now. Yes.
Hi, Tony. You constantly make reference to an eyewitness. Who is the eyewitness that you're referencing in the Bible?
Thank you. Sorry, just obviously assumed a little bit more. So Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are the 4 biographies of Jesus. We know that each one of those, Luke had access to eyewitnesses, the others had access to Jesus. And so they are the ones who put together those eyewitness accounts. Later on, Peter says in the New Testament, we didn't follow cleverly invented stories. Okay, so the New Testament authors are aware of this. We didn't want to follow some silly story, but we were eyewitnesses of the fact. Okay, and then he goes on to talk a bit more. So even within the New Testament, there's this understanding that we don't want to end up in a place with secondary sources as much as we possibly can. It's eyewitnesses actually to the resurrection of Jesus. That's that's actually key to their testimony. But it's those people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and some others who largely wrote the New Testament. And they, I guess, the witness that we are left with is that document. So we obviously don't have access to them, we have access to the documents written by them.
And how do you prove they're reliable?
Yeah, again, you've got to go to, I'll give a general answer and then you can work out how specific you want to be. You have to work out using other methods of history. Okay, so this is where I want to say using a scientific method in a historical context is like using a hammer to hit in a screw. It's the wrong tool for the wrong moment. When you're doing science, you use scientific method, you don't use historical method to evaluate truth. When you're doing history, you use historical method, not scientific method to assess and evaluate truth. Okay? So, what was the original question then? How is it reliable? Thank you. Yeah, how they reliable. So you've then got to use a bunch of criteria. Closeness, how much access do we have to, how close are they to the event? How close are the records that we have to the event? They're just some of the questions. So, and how many? So just to give you an example, there's something like 4,000 fragments all the way through to full copies of the New Testament in existence. Over 4,000. That is an astronomical amount. For Tacitus, the famous Roman historian, who comes a little bit, about 70 or 80 years after Jesus, we have 7. Okay? And so the bulk of material just gives you confidence or lack of confidence that allows you to do some of that assessment work. You've got to do the work around the witnesses that you have.
This one's for Scott along the same lines. What is your response to the claim that the 4 Gospels are eyewitness accounts for the life of Jesus Christ?
My simple response is we don't know that they're eyewitness accounts. They claim to be eyewitness accounts. Biblical scholars, there is huge disagreement about whether or not they were written by Mark, Luke, and John. There is literary evidence of doctrine in some of those books as well, that sections were deliberately inserted or changed to make the story of Jesus Christ fit the prophecies that were said in the Old Testament. The story of the birth of Jesus is different in every single one. Now, you can obviously say you're going to expect different accounts from different eyewitnesses. They see it all from a different point of view. But when we're talking about something as seemingly fundamental as the birth of a Messiah, you want there to be some agreement between your eyewitnesses. In a court of law, if there's any disagreement between eyewitnesses, a good defence attorney is going to say you need to disregard all of them, because you can't work out which one is actually telling the truth, which one actually saw it as it happened. So that's my first response. My second response is eyewitness accounts don't carry a lot of weight when we're talking about extraordinary events. If someone told you that they saw someone levitate, and we're talking outside of an entertainment theatre, outside of a magic show, that they levitated a foot above the street, you wouldn't take them at their word. And this is the sort of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about eyewitness accounts, especially historical eyewitness accounts. And I'll just finish on this idea that eyewitness accounts are the most reliable form of evidence in criminal trials. There's a current push supported by a huge amount of evidence that eyewitness accounts shouldn't even be considered in a criminal trial because they are so flawed. I'll give you this example. First off, who remembers where they were on September 11, 2001, or September 12, 2001, here in Australia? Who remembers where they were? Some of you might not. It's all right. So, a professor in America, the very next day, got his class to write down exactly what they did, what they were doing when they first heard that the Twin Towers in New York City had been hit by planes. And they wrote it down and handed it in. 6 months later, he got them to do the same task. Kept it. 1 year later, same thing. And then 3 years later. And then handed them out for students to compare what they had written down. So, someone 3 years later had wrote down that they were with their friends watching it on TV. The account that they wrote just 1 day after, the very next day after September 11th, they were in their car listening to it on radio. That is a huge difference in eyewitness account. So, and there's more evidence. If you want to delve into it, I can point you to some of the studies afterwards, or you can go away, go to the library and look at the studies yourselves. So eyewitness accounts are good for the mundane things. Did I have Weet-Bix for breakfast? You have no reason to doubt me on that, because it's a very ordinary claim. Did I make toast without a toaster? Maybe. I could have used a grill. Could have used an open flame. I made toast without any heat at all. Then we're getting into something that's a little bit hard to believe. And that's where I am with the supposed eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life.
That concludes our formal time together today. We will break and resume with other questions in about 5 minutes. Please take a moment to fill out the feedback form that you received on your way in. Tear it off and place it in the box by the door on your way in. Thank you for your attention and participation. I hope this time